Okay, hi guys. This is our last recorded lesson, as thankfully you are all going to be back next week, which we're really excited about. This is our last lesson. I hope we'll see how far we get. We may go into one more, but I really want to start wrapping up sense perception. And what I really want to do in today's lesson is for us to synthesize what we've learned so far, so that we can start thinking about how we will use the information that we've learned over the last couple of weeks in an essay or our presentation, which is ultimately why we're learning about everything. So I thought I'd kick off by showing you some past PTs or prescribed titles, which lent themselves well to sense perception. So these are ones that have happened over the last few years. In your essay, regardless of what the title says, you need to explore two areas of knowledge and consider examples to support your arguments. So in this lesson today, we're going to look at examples you can draw on in the different areas of knowledge. And also we're going to consider some real life situations which someone might use for a presentation. So just as a reminder, 1/3 of your final mark goes to the presentation, which you will start getting ready for at the end of term 4 this year, and you'll present in term 1 next year. And just as a bit of a heads up, it's going to be on Saturday, the 6th of March. That's right, we'll do a whole day on presentations. We will end the lesson reflecting on the key lessons that we have learned over the last couple of weeks. Okay, so there are a few links that I'm going to be posting up on OneNote, but really the main thing I want you to do in today's lesson is just to listen, look at the slides and just take some notes. It's just pretty much a sort of lecture style lesson, I'm afraid, which I know is perhaps a little bit boring, but that I just need to get all of that information to you soon, as clearly as I can. So first of all, then let's look at natural sciences. So how do we use sense perception in natural sciences? Remember, natural sciences is the study of the physical world. We've already looked at this area of knowledge, and the most obvious one to us is the fact that when we're doing our inductive reasoning, or through the scientific method, scientists are looking at specific things in order to make their broad generalizations. So it's through sight that they would be looking at specific, making those clear observations. Just a couple of examples here, and it's always good to use examples. So, if you happen to be writing something about natural sciences, this is one in 2011. There were some researchers that thought that they had observed a particle which travelled faster than the speed of light. However, they then uncovered a calculation error 3 months later, and half of the scientists resigned in shame of that. So, just where, we're not always certain what we found. And at the time, it was considered that we were on the brink of a paradigm shift, and people are a bit disappointed that hadn't happened. More recently, it's always good to use recent examples. The New Horizons probe found an object in space, which they thought it looked like kind of like two pancakes, if you like. And this is something that's been, the most distant object ever seen at 4 billion miles from Earth. And so one of the things that we can talk about in natural sciences is how we might use tools and apparatus and equipment to help us enhance our sense perception to be able to see things. So, for example, microscopes and stethoscopes and the like. Okay, human sciences then. So human sciences, it's really important that you understand it's the study of human behaviour. So it's not to do with the human body. Human body comes under natural sciences. So for human sciences, then obviously they need to observe human behaviour and hear what they have to say. So that's fairly obvious. A couple of really cool examples of experiments they've done where they've used senses is the sweaty t-shirt experiment. And so this was the idea that the pheromones that we emit when we sweat, so there's like those, I can't think of it now, the hormones that you emit when you sweat, that we as people, when we're choosing our mate, will automatically choose someone who has the opposite pheromones to us to ensure that evolution can continue. So we wouldn't, it's like a natural way of choosing a mate that's not then going to have issues with production, not going to have somebody with two heads or something like that. So that's the sweaty t-shirt experiment. There's also a couple of articles which I've put links up for in OneNote about music and how it impacts our emotions. And what you'll see as we're going through this is that we start talking about some other ways of knowing, because one of the things I hope that you've learned now is that we can't isolate our sense perception when we're gaining knowledge. It comes in combination with other ways of knowing. So a couple of articles that I found, one was about how music impacts the way people shop. So the idea is if you have slower music, the slower we shop and therefore we spend more. And then I thought this was quite interesting, obviously coming from London myself, that the roughest McDonald's in London has actually slashed its antisocial behaviour by playing classical music late at night. So often the McDonald's run 24 hours a day, and Shepherd's Bush had reported an enormous amount of unrest and fights and brawling, and so they actually slashed that behaviour by introducing classical music. And that could be quite a good one, I think, for a presentation potentially. It's quite a good one to explore. There's some good thoughts to think about, because it wasn't just the classical music they introduced other things as well, like increasing security guards. So you're never really quite sure if it is the music or if it's a combination of other strategies they've put in place. Another thing, human sciences isn't just about human behaviour. It is about human behaviour, but you might look at it through geography or economics. And obviously cartographers map our physical world, and obviously it's really difficult for somebody to map the whole world because it is so big, and so they would only be able to map parts of the world. And one of the things that we'd probably see is the bias of that cartographer. So someone who's Australian will probably want to map Australia, for example, or maybe someone who's got an interest in marine biology may decide to map Antarctica, just as an example. So in the arts then, arts involve creative expression. So, arts is very much involved with sense perception, and that's something. And one of the things that when we learn about art is the idea is that we want them to, an artist creates something to inspire that kind of emotional response from the viewer. And one of the things that sense perception can do is trigger emotions through memories. And I don't know if you've ever had that. I certainly know that if I smell rose water, for example, it reminds me of my grandmother. Like, my grandmother just used to wear this rose-smelling perfume, and I could just get one whiff of that, and it just takes me back to my grandma's house and being at grandma's. I've just realised I've made a bit of a mistake here, but there's black and white movies should be further down, but music can change the mood of a movie. And I've actually put on a link for you to listen to, and it's about Star Wars music, Star Wars with different types of music playing the beginning, and how that can actually change the mood of the movie and makes it sound a bit strange. And the other thing that I thought was quite interesting was about black and white movies. So there are some modern movies that have been made in black and white, and just thinking about the feeling or the mood that generates when you have a black and white movie. So there is that kind of idea that, if it's in black and white, then it's a bit artsy, it's a bit retro, a bit perhaps like high quality in a way, like a sort of clever, intelligent type movie. And you might be able to find some of those to use as an example. I've also put on the OneNote a link for a music quiz, if you fancy that, so you can listen to the music and try and guess which movie it is. And again, that's just that idea about a memory, you might recall who you watched that movie with and when. Okay, so history then, as we know, we use eyewitness accounts a lot in history. So we don't actually study history at Kellenville, but maybe you would have done over the last few years, and you would have looked at primary sources and secondary sources. So remember, primary sources are your first-hand accounts. So there might be an eyewitness describing something that they've seen, or taking a photograph of something. And one of the things that we do have to remember, and we will explore history as one of our areas of knowledge, it is a good one to do, we have to remember that there will be a subjective viewpoint or a bias from that eyewitness, because they're seeing it only from that one angle or from that one position. The other thing too, I think that's quite interesting when you think about sense perception, is that in some areas of knowledge, it might actually explain the knowledge, whereas I think in history, it would perhaps describe it. So, for example, just this year in January 2019, some archaeologists who were actually it was people digging in a car park, or to create a car park or something like that, and they came across these bones, and they actually discovered 52 bones, skeletons, and 17 of them they found had the skull between the feet. And so a lot of the work was then going to try and work out, well, why is it that, they had decapitated, and it was quite a clear cut why that had happened. And of course, we can never really know why they did that. All we can see is the pictures that we're given, and the sources that we can see. And this is obviously a primary source, but we're not really exactly sure why that is. So again, sometimes our sense perception can describe knowledge, but doesn't necessarily explain it. Maths, however, I can see a spelling mistake in my slide already. Visual representations in maths can help us understand concepts which are perhaps complex or abstract. And so therefore, perhaps in maths, sense perception can actually explain the knowledge rather than just simply describe it. So here's a couple of examples. There's a tree diagram there to show how probability works, and I've also found some graph there which demonstrates a quadratic equation. Our next area of knowledge will be maths, so we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so almost done. We're done on our areas of knowledge. Just to sort of try and wrap up everything that we've talked about. So these are the things that I hope that you have gleaned and understood over the last couple of weeks. The first thing is that our perceptions and the way that we view things can be affected by many factors, and we've got our biases, our motivations, our emotions, of course, cultural perspectives, interest, expectations, background experiences, our past experiences, and also where our focus of attention is. So these are all the things that we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. Another thing to remember is that sense perception is purely subjective. I noticed when I was looking at your OneNote, some of you got confused between subjective and objective. So remember, subjective means it comes from you inside. So your emotions will be subjective, your sense perception will be subjective. Your idea of reasoning will probably be objective, or it should be objective. So objective means when you can see it from somebody else's perspective. Remember, our brains interpret our senses, and so sometimes may fill a gap or they may misinterpret what we see. The other thing to remember is that if we are relying solely on sense perception to acquire knowledge, we may be limited by what we experience. So, for example, if you live in a highly censored environment, or under a dictator, we may be limited in what we see and what they allow us to see. And that can be very problematic if we are basing everything that we know based on what people allow us to see. And there are countries in our world that exist which are highly censored. And so that might be an interesting topic for you to look into and explore, either for a presentation or perhaps even as an example for your essay. So ultimately then, the main thing we have to remember then is that we have to use our sense perception in combination with other ways of knowing. We can't just use our sense perception. That's really not good. So these are all of those things there then I've talked about is things that you can include in your essay. And what I want to do now, I just want to look at examples of what you could explore in perhaps a presentation. So when we're thinking about sense perception in what we call a real life situation. So real life situations, you find an article or you find something that's of interest to you, and then you develop some knowledge questions. And we'll be talking a lot more about this towards the end of term 4, but I think it's important for you just to start collecting and start thinking about things like this. So first real life situation then, you might choose an eyewitness account, and I have again put on some links onto OneNote for you to explore and read at your own in your own time. So Ronald Cotton, Anne, African American, served 10 years in prison. And actually this photograph here is of Ronald Cotton and the woman who accused him of raping her, and he was sentenced based on her solely on her eyewitness account, and he was there for 10 years before finally the science of DNA came around and he was released. They discovered it wasn't him, and they actually found out the person it was. And so this guy was actually in prison for 10 years for something that he didn't commit. Similar story for Malcolm Alexander, again, an African American supposedly raped a white woman. And is it important to say what background or what race background? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and that's something that you can explore. And it could be, is it cultural biases of the person who's making those accusations, or is it irrelevant? And maybe it is. Anyway, so Malcolm Alexander actually was in prison for 38 years, which is a really, really long time for a crime he did not commit. So again, he was, I think it was in 1979 that he was put into prison, and then came out 38 years later in 2018, 2017. Just imagine spending 38 years of your life in prison. That's just completely incredible amount of time. So these are, if we want to start thinking about, well, what type of knowledge question could you have? This would be a great one, that idea about to what extent do we see things as we are rather than as they actually are. And if you look at those links, there's some really interesting, there's a YouTube documentary about the whole story of Ronald Cotton. And she talks about why she believes that she misidentified him, what it was that led to. She talks about her emotions and many other things. So it's really, really worth watching. I've also put up a link there, an article about why we can't trust our eyewitness accounts, and another one I've put on is about, that's right, it's a website called the Innocence Project. So there's lots of other examples of people who've been wrongly committed. And again, you might find that useful somewhere down the track. So then we get to another real life situation, and you might think, oh, that's all a bit gruesome, looking at people who've been committed inaccurately. This is a great one. So Joshua Bell, he's a really well-known violinist, and he normally charges about $200 for someone to go to one of his concerts. He's really, really, really well known, or very, very famous in certain circles, and that's one of the questions that we might ask. And he did an experiment where he busked in a New York subway, and he at the end of it wanted to see how much money he could make at the end of a shift. And they videoed it. There's a whole video, again, a YouTube video you can watch where you can see what happened. They speed it up so you can see how many people stopped to listen. I want to know how many people stopped to listen in a New York subway. It just really, really interesting. And at the end of his busking, he made a grand total of $38. And so, there was the comment about, do people really know art and all that sort of thing? But we have got some idea here about, and we have talked about this, about the role of the attention plays in gaining knowledge from our senses, or what role does past experience play in gaining knowledge from our senses? Because there's actually one man who does stop, and he stays there most of the time to watch it, and his past experience is that he guessed it might have been Joshua Bell because he'd actually been to one of his concerts before, so he kind of recognised him and recognised his music. The other thing that's interesting is that it's during a very, very busy time in the day. It's during rush hour, and we see the only other person really that stops is a child who's obviously his attention is quickly drawn to something that's a little bit different, while his mother's trying to hurry him off to school because that's all she's really focused on. So the idea about this is a really good one, again, to think about and explore, and something that you can talk about as an example. For example, Joshua Bell busked in New York and people didn't notice him because that's not where their attention was. And another one here. Oh yeah, that was about what role does the context of an artwork play in its appreciation? So this is really about the idea of the arts. So, if he was playing on stage at the Sydney Opera House, would we appreciate him more than if he was busking, in the subway in Sydney? If you've got a famous painting, if you saw the Mona Lisa, let's say, if you saw the Mona Lisa hanging up in a school, would you believe and appreciate that was the Mona Lisa, or would you say it's a copy because you would expect it to be hanging up in a museum? So just that whole idea about context. So that, I think, brings us, let me just double check what else we've got here. There's just a couple of links there. There's a link here as well I thought that you might be interested in, which looks at how art and science link with our senses. So again, something else that you can look at. So I'm hoping that you've taken down some notes. I would like you, I just want to see your notes this week and your second journal entry. And remember, I want to see some of these examples that we've talked about in any of those areas of knowledge brought up and thought about, and particularly try and get into that journal some of these key notes, try and include some of those things in there as well, because ultimately, remember, it's coming down to knowledge. So the other thing that I think would be really good for you to do is just click on some of those links that I've set you, have a look at those. There's some really fun ones there, and then there's some really interesting ones as well. So it's really important that you are spending your time starting to think about examples that you can use in your essay, and perhaps some real life situations you can use in a presentation. Anyway, I'm sorry it was a bit of a boring old lesson in the end, but I just wanted to wrap everything up as much as possible. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys next Thursday. It's so lonely and boring at school without you guys. Okay, take care. Bye.